Hello, my name is Cameron Toth. I'm going to be giving a brief review and reflection on the young adult poetry collection titled Pierced by a Ray of Sun, Poems About the Times We Feel Alone by Ruth Gordon. I would like to give a brief overview of the poetry collection. For starters, there are 73 poems in this novel, all selected by Ruth Gordon and written by different poets. And just to build some sort of reference, the collection starts out with a poem titled You Ask Me What It Means by Giovanni Giudici and ends with 20 Billion Light Years of Loneliness by Shintaro Tanikawa. There are many themes throughout the poems, but there seem to be four that stick out to me the most. There is a lot of discussion over identity, loss, and isolation that is heavily focused on. Given the introspectiveness found in the collection, it is also safe to say that there is a fair amount of reflection, whether that is over a particular feeling, circumstance, or other people. I also believe the summary on the inside cover of the book does a good job of describing what the collection of poetry is about. Ruth Gordon is able to find poetry that, quote, reveals the universality of sometimes feeling alone, lonely and alienated, end quote, but also shows how to quote, people have toughed it out and survived, end quote. In other words, Gordon has found poems that relate to a shared loneliness that we all feel at times, and also show circumstances where people have learned to conquer this negative feeling. Next, I want to discuss some of the connections I was able to make outside of the text itself. The first of which is a text-to-text connection. The first text that I was able to compare to this collection of poetry was the young adult novel titled The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzie Lee, which I covered 2 weeks ago in one of my reviews and reflections. Specifically, I wanted to talk about the character Felicity. She wants an education that is not finishing school because she fears that she's going to be squeezed into corsets and bullied into silence. In Pierced by a Ray of Sun, Gordon provides a poem that seems to mimic this fear. Janice Mirikitani's poem titled Recipe acts like a recipe. Instead of being about cooking, it is about how to do a round eye with makeup. After much detailed instruction, the last line delivered is "Do not cry." What the poem is insinuating is that the person following the recipe for the round eye is doing it out of a need to change their appearance to be more flattering. This change with the self, along with trying to fit into social expectation, prompts the recipe to list the direction to cry, or to not cry, because that is the reaction to this feeling of dissatisfaction. This relates to Felicity because she also feels that she is being pushed into certain expectations that demand her to change, and it also has a similar negative impact on her emotions along with the way she views herself. Moving on, another text I want to compare Gordon's collection to is The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie. There is a moment at the beginning of the novel where a young boy named Junior says that he prefers to draw rather than to speak, because words are unpredictable and limited. We see a similar way of thinking in another one of Gordon's provided poems called On Education by an anonymous author. In this poem, the speaker, just like Junior, finds that drawing is an apt substitute for verbal communication. The speaker says that since no one cares about the things he says, he turns to drawing instead. Another connection that I want to make is a text-to-self one. I found myself back in middle and high school when I read I Am a Rock by Paul Simon from Gordon's collection. The poem goes through the thoughts and feelings of a speaker who compares himself to a rock in a way that explains their disconnect to everything else around them. While I had friends during my time in school and was good about engaging in school and sports, I always sort of felt disconnected from everything, which I think was just me wanting to move towards college, excited to leave the routines that took up a lot of my time in the day during middle and high school. Still, I found my experience validated in Simon's poem, which makes sense because Gordon's selected poems are meant to cater to a young adult audience, and during my time in middle and high school, I was an adolescent. Now, to answer the question of, is this collection of poetry appropriate for young adults? I would answer yes. For starters, the text itself does a good job of being age appropriate in the sense of its content. It is appropriate in the way that it succeeds in reaching its target audience, young adults. One of the ways it achieves this is by adhering to the psychosocial developmental stage that adolescents go through. Erik Erikson calls the stage identity versus role confusion. According to him, this is when, quote, adolescents search for a sense of self and personal identity through an intense exploration of personal values, beliefs, and goals, end quote. There are many examples in the text that explore both the identity and role side of the search for self that young adults are going through. For the identity part, there is a good poem in Gordon's collection that fits this, called The One-Armed Boy by Joseph Hutcheson. In this poem, a boy is trying to find a way to identify himself outside of his physical disability. In the provided quote, he says that he wishes he hadn't been born with only one arm. For the rural confusion part, another one of Gordon's poems fits well for this, which is Childhood by Rainer Maria Rilke. The poem itself speaks on the loss of childhood, and one of the last bits of the lines is the provided quote. The speaker is pondering on how to move towards something new by using the comparison of a long thread. The speaker is confused about how they should proceed after losing their childhood and their new role moving forward. One thing to keep in mind when considering whether this collection of poetry, or just poetry in general, is appropriate for young adults is thinking about the way adolescents will respond to it. As is mentioned in our course's Week 12 lecture module called Poetry and Poetry Slams, there are many complications with assigning poetry for students to read. If they are forced to think about poetry too much as far as analysis is concerned, they will be taken away from experiencing the poem. This kind of thinking can apply to Gordon's collection of poetry as well. Despite the collection's small length of under 100 pages, there are still let me repeat that. Despite the collection's small length of under 100 pages, there are still 73 poems for readers to get through. While they are all good in my opinion and definitely would be engaging for the reader, it is important as an educator to make sure you don't burn your students out on what you want them to gain the most from. I just think this is something to consider when thinking about the collection of poetry in an educational context. Apart from that, I would highly recommend this book to any young adult. The final question I want to answer is how this collection of poetry is appealing to young adult readers. For starters, I touched upon this point on the last slide, but the text itself is relatively small. The 73 poems are only on the first 95 pages of the novel, which makes it a quick and easy read. I think this is definitely something that draws in readers. In an article titled Making Poetry Exciting for Teens, Karen Greenberg talks about this idea of instant gratification and how it can be accommodated through quick reads like poetry. I've already discussed how the content of Gordon's collection of poetry can relate to the adolescent experience, but when you add on that factor of easier accessibility, it makes it that much more appealing for young adult readers. Another part of this poetry collection that I think is appealing is the way it validates a sense of shared loneliness. Almost everyone goes through some period of time, no matter how long it lasts, where they feel alone in some way. Having 73 poems that speak on loneliness in one way or another can allow the reader to not feel, for lack of a better word, alone in this feeling. One of the last points that I think young adult readers will find appealing about this text is how the format itself contributes to their search for identity. In Just Slamming Adolescents' Construction of Identity Through Performative Poetry, Lynn J. Rudd talks about how literacy in itself builds, changes, and affects the way adolescents view who they are. Poetry is just another form of literacy, and Gordon's poetry collection is more than likely to influence the thought processes of struggling young adults looking to define themselves. This all comes back to Erikson's psychosocial developmental stage for adolescents that I pointed out earlier. He mentioned that one of the main concerns for young adults is their pursuit and understanding of identity. Because this is something that they are experiencing at their age, the text itself that relates to this experience will probably appeal to them as well. Thank you for listening to my brief review and reflection on Ruth Gordon's poetry collection titled Pierced by a Ray of Sun, Poems About the Times We Feel Alone. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts and opinions about the text. Here's my reference list that covers all my sources on each slide. Thanks again for watching.